Hello, and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Caledonian Highlander army. Today, as with usual faction focus videos, we'll be talking about who Caledonia are, how they play, what makes them different or unique, what are their limitations, before jumping into Infinity Army to talk through some of the profiles that exemplify the faction. As always, big thanks to channel supporters that make videos like this possible, including, in this case, channel supporter Damond, who requested a faction focus for the Caledonian Highlander army. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either by becoming a member on YouTube or on the Buy Me a Coffee page in the video description below. Now, Caledonia. Caledonia are a faction I've actually been keen to do a faction focus for a little while, because although they are not my most played N3 faction, they're kind of up there, and I have some things that I want to say. And where I want to start is actually with a little bit of a hype man impression, because we're going to be starting by talking about the miracle of Caledonia. Now, I typically try to speak at least somewhat positively about factions in these faction-focused videos because the audience for these videos is people who are enthusiastic or interested in those factions. But in the case of Caledonia, I have a particular enthusiasm because this is a faction that, by rights, shouldn't be playable in N4. Like, it should just not be competitively viable, and it is. And to explain why that's kind of the case, as we sometimes do in these videos, we're going to peel back the veil of history a little bit and look at where Caledonia has come from, and in particular, where they were in N3. Caledonia were one of the boogeymen of N3, and for good reason. They exemplified some of the things you could do in that edition that has been thoroughly and aggressively pared back, including in one notable case, a list that included almost 40 troops across 4 combat groups. Now, it was never totally clear how competitively powerful this list was. It was absolutely very strong, and the one person that ran it, without proxies, I will note, went undefeated in the event that they played in, but it didn't exist for long enough before the edition changed to really see if there were counters for it. But to be perfectly honest, 40 troops is just too difficult. It takes too long to kill 40 troops in some games of Infinity to reasonably assume that many factions have a chance against that. And so, if we think about that list, or even just lists like it, more sane Caledonian lists still regularly ran a comfortable 20 troops. They used things like 5-point Galwegians to trade up into enemy like 15, 20, 30-point pieces. They were just this army that played incredibly wide, incredible value. And so if you'd come to me sort of at the end of N3 and you'd said, Rob, you know how the Caledonian Highlander army plays. What if I told you that the next edition we're going to have changes like a maximum of 15 troopers, and we're going to change link teams so that core fire teams with something like a Highlander Grey in a group of volunteers loses all of the ballistic skill bonus. It's now just +1 ballistic skill rather than +3. And we're going to give buffs to hackers and tags and like elite hackable heavy infantry to make those a big part of most factions' game plans. And we're not really going to add anything to Caledonia over basically the entirety of N4, maybe one model. It'll be okay, but like one model. I would have said, well, the faction's just not going to exist in N4 then. It's just going to be, it's going to be dead weight. It's going to be something that we think about occasionally, but just really doesn't have any kind of a presence. And if I had owned Caledonia, I might have done a quick fire sale. Like, local man makes $1,000 in an hour, ask me how, by selling an entire army, that kind of thing. But as it's turned out, Caledonia has translated. They're not the same, right? Caledonia in N4 is not the same as Caledonia in N3, but it does still have a hell of a lot going for it. And over the about 12 to 15 games I've had with Caledonia in this edition, they have all been absolute bangers, and in all of them, the faction has felt strong. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the miracle of Caledonia in N4. In N4, Caledonia are just about the undisputed king, or at least one of the undisputed kings, of the absolutely bananas models, all worth less than 30 points category. They just have a huge number, or they can take a huge number of models that fit in this category where the piece costs between 20 and about 28 points. And, maybe it's single wound or 2 wounds, but it's an efficient piece, and efficiency at that points cost tends to mean that, maybe you're a single wound trooper with 0 armor, but you've got potential. Troopers that are 20 to 30 points but are efficiently costed and powerful, start creeping into that scale where any one of those troopers might just be able to do something that can win you the game. They're troops that can potentially take on much more powerful adversaries or groups of adversaries. They're troops that can break through or shatter defenses in the right place at the right time. And because they aren't the cost of like super heavy infantry, you can take a lot of them. And so this creates a situation where, yes, Caledonia has had to compress to 15 troopers just like every other faction. But where Caledonia used to use 5-point Galwegians to trade up into 15 to 20-point elite enemy infantry and specialist pieces, now you use 20 to 27-point Cameronians, SAS, Usha McNeil, McMurrah to trade up into 50 to 100-point enemy super heavy infantry, or tags, or entire link teams. And so that incredible ability to trade and redundancy still exists, it's just scaled to the 15 trooper environment. And so this means the quintessential N4 experience for the Caledonian Highlander army is saying, well, gosh, you killed my 20-point close combat monster. Good thing I have 7 more. And that just means that they have a huge amount of play. They are also an inspiring leadership faction, and you can bet we'll be talking about that. And they are basically just an incredible value faction, all the way from the top of the list, pieces like Wallace and Greys and the characters, all the way down to the very cheapest stuff at the bottom of the army, things like 6-point volunteers. Everything is efficiently costed, and this means that even though you literally can't take a 100-point tag piece, that power still exists, and perhaps the amount of power in your list, because your pieces are so efficient, is higher than it would be in a faction where, yes, okay, you have the avatar, but then you have the avatar and you are scraping to fit anything else. A Caledonian list has 7 or 8 pieces, all of which can theoretically kill the avatar. And that's how they play. You will be aggressing and maneuvering and throwing smoke and laying down suppressive fire and engaging with pieces that are not expensive but can trade up into expensive and powerful things and accomplish mission objectives and generally just overperform. And when you have so many pieces that are capable of overperforming, you will see in every game overperformance. And that is just super cool. Now, we should acknowledge that there are still limitations to Caledonian Highlander Army as a faction. Firstly, this is still an N3 sectoral. The roster is not particularly deep. We will be talking about almost the entire roster when we get into the army section of the video. They just don't have that many profiles, and this has effects on how they play. Firstly, and probably most significantly, it does impact their midfield. Some of the best midfield pieces in the game are Caledonian Highlander army pieces, by which I mean SAS. SAS are some of the best midfield pieces in the game, and that's what Caledonian Highlander army has. And they have nothing else, which means that your opponent, when they see camouflage markers that are outside of your deployment zone, can basically always know what's underneath them. It's going to be a psycho that's exceptional in close combat and accomplished mission objectives and is not very expensive, but that certainty, that knowledge, enables game plans that are a little bit cleaner against Caledonian camouflage markers. You're also only going to have so much depth of list, and also you're an Ariadnan faction, which doubles down on that. So you're not going to have hacking, you're not going to have Eclipse, you're not going to have any of those like interesting and complicated toys. You are playing Ariadna, so you are limited by the technology of your time. And in combination with a limited roster, this means that the Caledonian Highlander army is not really suitable as a faction that you might main in N4. They are an outstanding expansion to Ariadna, or particularly Cosmoflot. If you jumped into Ariadna with Cosmoflot, if they were the faction that you started with, you'll already have some of the pieces that you need to play the Caledonian Highlander army. You might give some serious consideration to just thinking about how you can do a couple of bits of proxying, maybe buy a couple of pieces that can expand the faction out. That's where Caledonia shines, as a faction that you play as part of a broader factional experience, not as just a faction that you play by itself, because they're not really deep enough to be satisfying in that respect. Now, in addition, because they are an Ariadnan limited sectoral, you can run into gear checks that can be a little bit of a pain. So MSV AROs in particular, you often need to have a plan for. You need to think about how you're going to deal with something like, for example, a Riot Girl core link with missile launchers on Overwatch. And you're going to typically just be using forward observers and the occasional medic as specialists outside of scenarios where you specifically pay a lot of points for your very limited hacking presence, which means that in a well-rounded or all-comers kind of list that's trying to play lots of different scenarios, you might not have specialist bonuses in like Supremacy, for example, because it's one of the rare cases where you have to pay a premium for that kind of capability. And this can mean that sometimes you have to just brute force your way through mission objectives, just rolling 13s to succeed. It's fine, you can do that, you'll have the order count to do that, but it's a luxury that you are missing, being able to just roll up to an objective in something like Acquisition and accomplish it with near certainty. The nature of the roster is also going to mean that engaging super heavy pieces is something that you are not 100%, but you are mostly going to have to do in close combat. You have exactly one piece that is potentially very good at dealing with enemy hard, like very like tough, super heavy pieces at range, plus a couple of other sort of scuffed options. And although we will be talking about the Mormea, it is a sometimes food. It's not something that you'll put in every list because it is high risk, high reward. More often you're going to be forced into close combat to solve your problems. And while that is fun, I enjoy playing close combat oriented armies, it's something that you have to learn. You have to learn how to use marker states and smoke to close with your opponent and engage in CC. And although the list that I will showcase at the end of this episode will certainly have fire support designed to be able to suppress enemy pieces, take gunfights of opportunity, it is not an all guns forward kind of list that can just really aggressively shut down enemy ARO pieces. You're going to be rolling a lot of ballistic skill 13 and kind of hoping that connects, and you're doing it with efficient pieces, but sometimes that is just going to fail you, or it's going to take longer for pieces like that to suppress enemy pieces. Building a firepower-based Caledonian Highlander list is possible, but it's not quite leaning into the faction's strengths. It's more trying to do things that the faction doesn't necessarily lean directly toward, so you'll be taking fewer of those very efficient 20 to 27 point pieces that I mentioned because you're trying to fit in, for example, armor-piercing Spitfires, which the faction has, but you will pay for them. Overall, though, playing Caledonian Highlander Army is one of my favorite experiences that I have had in N4, both discovering the faction, just sort of like trying them out, and then realizing that there was stuff there that I really liked. And it is my very great joy to be able to sit down and talk about some of that. And with that, let's jump into Army. Now, as much as I want to jump straight into the close combat maniacs, because they are some of the most exciting stuff to discuss in this faction, we are going to have our meat and potatoes before we have our sweets. And that means talking about our basic, solid link options, our line infantry and the things that will add into them, and then kind of like our leadership options. And that means starting with the Caledonian Volunteer Corps. Now, there are a lot of profiles here, but we are going to ignore most of them, including, to my great sadness, the camouflage midfield options. Yes, you have a Dalami equivalent piece in this faction, but they do not have Dalami equivalent weapon loadouts. Just a rifle on a ballistic skill, yes, and decharges, I don't care. Just a rifle on a ballistic skill 10 midfield piece is not worth 11 points. And a light shotgun is lovely, but stapling 1 SWC and 5 extra or 6, 7 extra points to it to get to 13 total makes the light grenade launcher. Look, you could consider the light shotgun grenade launcher infiltration camouflage volunteer. It does have a light shotgun. You could potentially use it if you had oodles of SWC spare to spice up your midfield. It's actually not something that I hate now that I'm talking about it out loud, but realistically what we are playing with is two profiles here. We are playing with the paramedic, which is a rifle, a medkit. It is 10 points for a linkable medikit who is a specialist. Nothing else about this profile is good, just by the by. Ballistic skill 10, Phys 11 is kind of nice, but ballistic skill 10, whip 12, there is a reason why this model is cheap, and it is indeed cheap at 10 points. And then we have Glory Be 6 points for a chain rifle light shotgun profile. Now, this model is as expensive as a Netrod, and it has two guns, both of which are serviceable template weapons. Yes, a Netrod is veteran, which is why it is 6 points. But getting a regular, linkable, viable corner guard model for so few points is actually part of what made N3 Caledonia obscenely powerful, a meta boogeyman. And although we will no longer be taking like 20 of these, we will be taking often a couple, one or two, alongside paramedic volunteers as the basis of smaller Harry's teams and 3-person corps. You can expand these out to a 5-person corps and then put a model with a gun in there, but that tends to be not necessarily a lot of points because it's quite cheap, but it's a lot of troop slots just for +1 ballistic skill on a linked in wildcard. It's an option, but I generally wouldn't advise it. Instead, I like to take these in little 3-person teams, one template chain rifle light shotgun, one paramedic, and then one gun from a different regiment dropped in gives you an incredibly cheap, very serviceable, kind of does everything, close assault, presses buttons, recovers your troops using the paramedic, and fights with Highlander Greys. And so it's the third Highlander Grey rifles that we have to mention kind of in the same breath as volunteers because they form a link team together. You need one volunteer to form the link, but once you've got at least one volunteer, you can add up to 3 Highlander Grey rifles, and that can't be formed as a duo, but it is a viable Haris or core team. And Highlander Greys are very cool profiles. Now, you will note, again, we're starting to talk about the troopers now, where, yeah, they cost 20 plus points, but never more than about 28. And there's a lot that's going on here. And we're going to just start with how the profile is built, because this is not a no-wound incapacitation trooper. It is just dogged, although it is dogged and shock immune, with armor 3, which is quite solid, and then just a general stat spread that is made very, very cheap by the fact that they are a frenzy profile that is not paying for that much close combat. Like, CC 21 is enough that if you're in CC, you're kind of annoying to deal with, but it isn't expensive, and that means that for 28 points, we get a model with a +1 damage heavy machine gun, ballistic skill 13, linkable smoke grenades, dogged, courage, armor 3, shock immune, with just enough of everything to be, yep, that's just enough. Like, you put that in a 3-person team, it's burst 5, BS 13. That is good enough a lot of the time, and we can easily put 2 of those teams, or even sometimes 3 of those teams if you force sort of like a different duo with just maybe grey rifles as a duo because they can legally duo by themselves. You can put a lot of these guys into a list, or even just a couple, but they are your go-to cheap asterisk efficient firepower piece. We can, and we will look at more mayors a little bit down the line. Ariadne and single wound heavy infantry starting with M, my apologies. But it's the Highlander Greys that are your go-to cheap heavy infantry in this efficient Caledonian package. And it is usually going to be heavy machine gun plus paramedic volunteer plus chain rifle volunteer. The other profiles here are all kind of good as well. They're just going to be a bit more rarely used. Where the heavy machine gun is firing at very, very long range, you otherwise have, for 25 points, a T2 rifle with a +1 burst light shotgun, which in a link or a pure core, potentially, is going to be burst 4, and burst 4 templates are very cool. That profile also has grenades in addition to its smoke grenades, and we'll talk about the smoke grenades in just a second. Or we can go all the way down to a mere 20 points, which has a T2 boarding shotgun. Again, all of these are ballistic skill attack +1 damage, so those light shotguns are damage 14, the T2 boarding shotgun is damage 15, and then smoke grenades, regular grenades, and decharges. We also have a lieutenant profile here in the form of the 25-point Highlander Grey LT, who, alongside, I guess, potentially the volunteer with a rifle, is one of the models you might consider if you aren't taking Wallace as your lieutenant. And the general usefulness of these 25 and 20-point profiles, rounding out, like maybe you want to have a more durable or more dangerous close assault element in a little 3-person volunteer team, or maybe you'd like to do a duo of a T2 rifle, light shotgun +1 burst, and heavy machine gun. That is coming in at just over 50 points for 2 models, but they're both dangerous by linking they counterlight each other's frenzy, and they can aggressively move around the board and take gunfights. The final thing I kind of want to note about these is just how useful the fact that the damn things have smoke grenades is, and how just like weirdly game-changing it is to have a smoke grenade on your firepower piece. Because it opens up, firstly, it just means that you should never run out of smoke in Caledonian Highlander army. You'll have it on your Dog Warriors, you'll have it on some of the characters. I think Usha has smoke grenades, and you'll have it on your firepower pieces in the form of the Highlander Grey Rifles. And that's even before we add any Galwegians to a list, which are 5-point models with smoke grenades. Wallace has smoke grenades. You should just never be out of smoke, and that's in large part because, in addition to your assault pieces, your gunfighting pieces have it as well, which means that that Harris team I just mentioned with the volunteers also serves as a burst 2 Fizz 13 smoke platform, which is super useful. And it also opens up smoke as an ARO option. And but hear me out here. You don't always have a ton of ARO pieces depending on how you build Caledonian Highlander Army. There are some, and they have, varying utility. But sometimes you are in a position where you just decide that this turn I need to make my opponent fight me for a little bit before they close in or accomplish an objective or something like that. And that allows, in a kind of weird way, the heavy machine gun Highlander Grey, provided it's in a link and being burst 2, to serve as an ARO piece, because if it's something that they will threaten with their heavy machine gun, like enemy impetuous troops, they'll just shoot with a burst 2 heavy machine gun. And if it's something that badly outclasses them, like an avatar, for example, they just say, nope, I don't want a piece of that, and they throw burst 2 on 16's smoke grenades and just smoke themselves out. And even though that is obviously non-lethal to your opponent, if it's like a Mimetism 6 piece, 2 dice on 16s is an astoundingly high chance of success, especially in comparison to the face-to-face roll you would have had if you tried to shoot the Mimetism 6 piece, which is just a huge quality of life effect and adds this just little extra sometimes roll to what is already a very good piece. The only thing that's keeping Highlander Greys from being frankly overpowered is ultimately that they are a dogged piece rather than a no-win incapacitation piece. And you also won't always choose to use that dogged. They are shock immune, there are going to be paramedics nearby. You will sometimes choose to just go unconscious, particularly if it's in your reactive turn, and spend an order trying to recover them, even if it's just 1 dice with a paramedic. But ultimately, these guys are kept in check by the fact that they are much closer to single wound troopers than multi-wound troopers. Sometimes dogged is referred to as 1.5 wounds, and yeah, I mean, I guess that is kind of the case. About half of the time you will find yourself getting some real value out of that extra wound for a turn, and then you will die. But it's certainly the close assault ones, the ones with shotguns and rifles, etc., that benefit more in that respect. If you have to go dogged with your heavy machine gun, it usually means you are committing to your own death in order to just have a few more attempts at suppressing an enemy hard ARO piece, which is always an uncomfortable situation to be in. Nevertheless, I have not to date run a Caledonian list without 2 Highlander Grey Rifles, and I've had at least 1 game going all the way up to the full 5 in different configurations, and they have never disappointed. Oh, by the way, didn't even mention this, they're 6-2 move! They're very, very good, especially in combination with volunteers, who they pair with wonderfully for an incredibly efficient, just discount does everything fire team option. It has templates, it has specialists, it has smoke, and it has guns. You could not ask for more for the price. Rounding out the meat and potatoes section, we will talk about our most common lieutenant profile, which is William Wallace. Now, you do not always have to take William Wallace as your lieutenant, or even at all. If you do take him, he typically will be your LT. Because when all is said and done, 35 points is expensive. Now you get a lot for your 35 points. Like, Wallace is the cheapest inspiring leadership lieutenant in the game, and he is still expensive, but you get a great deal for the 35 points. But 35 points is still going to be much more expensive than often almost any other model in your army. It's very possible to write a list where Wallace is like 7 points cheaper than the next most expensive model, and half again the price of almost your entire list. However, at the end of the day, his personal profile and inspiring leadership in particular are kind of just that good that he is, if not an auto take, he is one of the reasons why you might choose to play the Caledonian Highlander army, because inspiring leadership is super cool and fun to play with. So just to break down the profile, for 35 points, you get a surprisingly serviceable shooter, ballistic skill 13, but he has a T2 rifle plus 1 damage, light shotgun, and smoke grenades. You get significant durability thanks to armor 3, no wound incapacitation, shock immunity, and critical immunity. And you have insane close combat with Berserk on 27s, whopping 6-4 movement, and a Fizz 14, CC attack plus 1 damage, explosive close combat weapon that he can then Berserk with. It is very, very possible to close out games with the Caledonian Highlander army just rampaging with William Wallace because he's 6'4" move and he throws smoke on 17s and he kills things in close combat and he's surprisingly durable and he shoots. And there's a good chance that he, if you want to, has worked his way up the field a little bit thanks to inspiring leadership, which is the other big thing about William Wallace. Now, let's talk about inspiring leadership because there are two effects that it has, and it's very easy to confuse yourself about which is the more important. The less important part of inspiring leadership is that it makes all of your irregular models regular. That is not actually a colossal deal in N4 because you aren't going to be taking that many irregular troops anyway. Gone are the days where we pad our entire list out with war correspondents and Galwegians and make them all regular. We don't have the troop slots for that anymore. These days, you're looking at like maybe 3 or 4 irregular pieces in a list, which is a lot, right? Like Hack Islam struggles to hit 4 irregular troopers without feeling a little bit of a pinch, and you just do it kind of for free thanks to inspiring leadership. But that is not a truly transformative effect. It's just kind of nice. It's not by itself worth the investment of Wallace. The reason why inspiring leadership is actually incredible, the far more important element, is that it turns the lieutenant order every turn for free into a coordinated order, which is better than strategos, right? Like strategos just gives you a regular order. Getting a coordinated order is the equivalent of having a regular order and a command token every single turn. Now, you don't have the flexibility to spend those exactly how you would like, but coordinated orders are very, very useful. Just even if you just use it for moving other troops around the field every turn, that is effectively the equivalent of 3 extra regular orders spent moving, plus Wallace shifting around as well. It's just prodigiously high value. Coordinated orders are good, and getting a free coordinated order every turn makes a massive, massive deal. Now, Wallace needs to be the leader of that, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. If you are learning Caledonia, just use it for taking safe move actions to push your things around because we are running an army that has a lot of close combat, a lot of close assault. And being able to stage, right, to move into a position where they can subsequently assault the enemy, large numbers of close combat pieces is part of what makes a close combat oriented army work. Any army that plans to engage the enemy at literally point blank range, right, literally in close combat, has to have a plan to get there. And that plan doesn't just mean how to cross the enemy lines of fire, it means how to physically cover the distance, how to get all the way across the table and into close combat. And you have things like infiltration that help with that, you have impetuous activations, and the third part of that particular puzzle is 3 troops in addition to Wallace every turn in his combat group being able to make 2 movements for free, even before we get to the other potential applications of coordinated orders, like using them to shoot, which you will sometimes do. And it's for that reason, it's for all of those things that I just said, that if I'm writing a Caledonian list, I'm putting Wallace in there. And that's because he's super freaking cool, and I like playing with super freaking cool things. It's part of what sets Caledonia apart. If I played Caledonia exclusively, I strongly expect he wouldn't make Lieutenant slot in all of my lists. In fact, he might not even be in the majority of them if I mained Caledonia exclusively. But I don't. I play them as part of a broader Ariadne experience, which I play as part of a broader Infinity experience. And that means that when I jump into a faction, I want to do the cool stuff, and Wallace is one of the super cool things. He is expensive, but he's very good, very powerful, and he tends to produce fun moments, either because of the inspiring leadership or because he personally goes out and slaps every single game. Now, from Wallace, we neatly segue into our close combat maniacs. And there are 2 regiments and 2 associated characters that fulfill a lot of this role. And we're going to start with irregular Cameronians, who often, because of Wallace, won't be irregular Cameronians, they will be regular Cameronians. Cameronians are a dog warrior troop, they share availability with McMurrough. That note down the bottom is kind of weird where it says that there can't be more than 2. What it means is that you can have 3 Cameronians in a list, but if you do, one of them has to be Wallace. Otherwise, you can have 2. So you can have 2 Cameronians, or 1 Cameronian and McMurrough, or McMurrough, but you can't have 3 Cameronians. One of them has to be McMurrough. And that's fine, because McMurrough is awesome, and so are Cameronians. Now, Cameronians are what I have jokingly called in the past a main battle warband, and what we might call a rapid offensive unit, something that is capable of very aggressively crossing the field and going and doing damage to your opponent. They are a dog soldier, one of the Ariadne dog soldier archetypes, and at 20 points they are the cheapest one. And they come with some limitations for that, but overall they are an excellent package. So what do we get? We get 6-4 move with CC 23, but it's very important to note no really special close combat skills. They are just CC23. Natural Born Warrior is not going to help them out most of the time, which means in close combat they will often be favored, but they won't be like truly elite close combat favored. They'll just be solid in close combat, good enough. They are Phys 16, Whip 12, Armor 4, which is higher than some other dog warriors, and they have 2 wounds. 6-4 move with Super Jump makes them very mobile. Phys 16 with Smoke Grenades makes them extremely effective at laying down smoke. And then in addition to their AP CCW at CC23, damage 16, they have a +1 burst chain rifle, excellent, and grenades and smoke grenades. And it's the grenades that are going to be very important. They are easy to miss, and it is the presence of grenades that actually makes Cameronians more competitive in the comparison with other pieces of their type in Ariadne than you might initially think, because Phys 16 grenades can do a lot of work. Firstly, if you just get close to the enemy, you are spec firing on 13s, which is a very high number to spec fire on. Sometimes you can work a Cameronian up and around over the course of a game, and then just bomb out a link team by throwing like 3 or 4 grenades on 13s, which can rapidly decimate a light infantry link team at no risk to yourself. The grenades will also give you a face-to-face roll against someone who is dodging a chain rifle. If you haven't gotten into close combat yet, and you're firing 2 chain rifles, and you have an enemy like light infantry skirmisher, for example, attempting to dodge those chain rifles, you can literally huck a grenade at their head, and if you're in good range, you're hitting on 19s. Now, obviously hitting on 23s would be better, but remember that you have that option open. Otherwise, these guys have got all of the things going for them that make Dog Warriors so good. They are tough, armor 4, and 2 wounds, and immunity total means that they can just waltz through flash pulses and adhere. There are whole swaths of arrows that they just literally ignore because of total immunity, especially flash pulse arrows. They can push forward, they can aggressively attack, they can fork either the chain rifle and grenades or the chain rifle and close combat. You do have to limit your expectations to them. What they are held back most of all by is the fact that they are only CC23 with no real martial arts skills, which stops them from really bullying, punching down at things in close combat. But as a piece that is just very difficult to kill and very dangerous and very fast and very cheap, right? These things absolutely motor. They are 20 points and they are 6-4 super jump that can be moved by both Impetuous and their own orders and coordinated orders from Wallace. They are a pretty essential part, if nothing else, of your defensive mix. Like, there are factions that would pay not a great deal less than this for a corner guard some of the time, and you have a full Cameronian at that cost. So a very good piece, a very fun piece, but they do need to be used carefully, and you need to bear in mind their limitations. Now, that limitation is mostly around their close combat ability, which isn't quite as good as you'd think it is. That is not the case, however, with Mora, Mercenary Dog Warrior, who is basically just a Cameronian with martial arts. Now, he gets a few more upgrades for the cost. He's better at dodging. He has an APDA rather than just APCCW, which actually is really good. He's Whip 14, which, given that he's a character and can therefore do certain classifieds, being Whip 14 is very nice. But most of what you're doing here is you're paying 7 extra points for the CC weapon and the martial arts. And the martial arts makes a huge difference because against some sort of just like a tag or a pleb in close combat, going from CC 23 to 26 has a massive effect on the face-to-face roll. Where a Cameronian will sometimes get stuck in close combat and doesn't necessarily want to fight things that are kind of like good-ish at CC, Mora has no such qualms. Provided you are not facing something that is an elite close combat skills natural born warrior like an Uberfell commando, Mora will comfortably take that fight and kick ass. Very, very good. He's considered an absolute monster in almost every faction that you can take him in, and no exception in the Caledonian Highlander army. The main difference is that in Caledonians, he's doing kind of like more of what you can already do, which is totally fine and good and a synergy. It's not like in some other factions where Mora adds a transformative capability because they don't otherwise have pieces like him. In Caledonia, we have many pieces like Mora, it's just that he is one of the best, and he is very, very good. Next up in our list of close combat maniacs, we have our skirmishers, the Highlanders SAS. Now, these guys, we can basically ignore every profile but one, because there is one profile that is just a standout, but what a standout. It is the SAS Forward Observer, and that is because from the base 20-point chain rifle light shotgun profile, for 1 point, we add, firstly, the fact that you're a specialist, secondly, a flash pulse, and thirdly, D-charges. And D-charges on a maniac that is jumping out of out of camouflage into close combat with surprise attack and martial arts is a very, very good close combat weapon. I can and have one-shot multiple tags with a D-charge crit from surprise, including on one notable occasion the Avatar, which was a very, very good day. So, what do we have in the Forward Observer Highlander SAS profile? We have Close Combat 22 with Martial Arts 2 and Surprise, which is that's the bare minimum to be considered excellent at close combat. We'll be rolling most of the time on 25s. Our opponents will be rolling on like a Fusilier will be down to 11s or something. I don't know what Pan-Oceanian and CC stats are, who cares? Particularly with Surprise, that gives you a massive margin of advantage, a near certainty to win, and winning translates into a D-charge applied directly to the face. The rest of the profile is frankly pretty lean, which is why this model literally only costs 21 points. We have Camouflage and Mimetism, nice to have. Remember that you can do things with Camouflage, you can like sneak around your opponent. If they delay, you walk into their back arc, then you can walk into close combat, stuff like that. And we have a Chain Rifle and a Light Shotgun, which is just nice. That's just cool. That is the cheapest possible. I mean, a light shotgun alone would be cheaper, but that is a very cheap template-centric loadout that is just going to do serviceable work if you ever have to do something like trade into a link team or sell your life in ARO. They have no armor, they only have an AP shock CCW for when the D-charges run out, but if you have applied 3 D-charges to something, there is a very, very good chance that your 21-point SAS Forward Observer has more than paid for themselves. Now, they are going to be one of your specialists, they are only whip 13, they almost never have specialist bonus in scenarios, but you have plenty of orders, and just rolling with whip 13 will get there eventually. The fact that there are forward observers is also going to have a small synergy that we will mention when we get to the kind of like wildcard and spice elements, which is coming up relatively soon, but we'll get to that when we get there. Overall, at 21 points, the forward observer SAS is frankly one of the best, if not the best for cost, close combat skirmish model like in the game, just period. It is one of the most incredibly efficient profiles. It is extremely dangerous to anything it gets into close combat with the sole exception maybe being like martial arts expert tags, but even they aren't typically surprise immune, which can give you a bit of an edge, or at least make you likely to win perhaps the first face-to-face roll. Very, very good piece. And as McMurrough is to the Cameronians, so Usha Cherry McNeil, Corporal of the 1st Highlanders, is to the Highlanders SAS. She is our character SAS, and we will usually be taking the 27-point profile. Now, what we are getting for our 27 points here is, firstly, she has Impetuous, which is actually going to come up quite a lot of the time. Remember that if you score a kill, you will lose the ability to take cover, and you'll lose the ability to re-enter camouflage at the end of the turn in the states phase, which is often going to mean that she kind of has a one-way ticket to most of the missions that she is taking. However, for 7 extra points, or for 6 extra points, and wearing the fact that she has Frenzy, which genuinely matters since she isn't linkable, we get an Assault Pistol +1 burst, which means burst 5, or burst 2 in ARO against something that you don't need to use D-charges against. She still has D-charges, she has Smoke Grenades, and she has Infiltration +6, which means that on a 16, she can land up to your opponent's deployment zone. Now, yes, all things considered, she is kind of a Assassin for Day at home, but a Assassin for Day does not have a burst 5 weapon with Mimetism, She can, and this is what sets her apart from pieces like a Assassin or even a Speculo, is that she can actually gunfight. Now, she's only ballistic skill 11, but she's going to be firing 5 dice with those assault pistols, and she has mimetism. And she has camouflage to maneuver to potentially catch her opponent out of cover, which means she can actually have turns where she just goes on a turn firing those pistols. I have even had situations where she's gotten deep enough that she's been able to shoot back into the back arcs of the opponent from like 10 to 16 inches. And yes, she's hitting on 11s, but she has 5 dice. And that just makes her high watermark of potential very high. Now, perhaps of all of the pieces we've talked about, she is one of the ones that has the most potential to be feast or famine, because she has that that infiltration +6, because she has frenzy, but she's discounted accordingly. She has the ability to make ballistic skill attacks, but they are good, but they are not truly incredibly reliable. She has very good close combat, but she is still only armor 0. Her high watermark is literally wins the game by herself, and her low watermark is you didn't go first. She deploys as a camouflage marker kind of alongside the rest of your SAS, and maybe she does something vaguely SAS-like at some point over the game, or is a specialist. And that's fine. It's not necessarily what we want. We're paying, there's a lot of variance there that we're paying our 27 points for, but she is still very often going to be worthwhile as part of your close combat assault package, because that high watermark is just so high. And having situations where maybe the scenario is very go second favored, having a plan where your opponent is either likely to want to stop you from going first because they are afraid of Usha, or you just have a very good offensive option in the form of Usha if you do go first, is just a nice to have. She doesn't make every one of my lists, and the fact that she costs exactly the same points as McMurra often means you might be picking one or the other, and that is the case in the list we're going to show at the end of the episode. But very, very, very solid and well, not solid, very, very potentially powerful, if a little variable, but the high watermark for that variance is awesome. Now, the second to last close combat maniac to showcase is Den McConnelly. At this stage, we know who Den McConnelly is and what he does. He's not particularly special or unique in the Caledonian Highlander army. He is just sometimes kind of as good as a Cameronian if he rolls well on metachemistry, and he's much cheaper. Ultimately, he is good close combat and Fizz 14 smoke and, good movement stats. He is in most respects a nice upgrade over a cheaper impetuous close combat model, or a tolerable downgrade from a more expensive close combat model. He's just good. And we have space in this army for things that are good in close combat. He won't be by any means in every list. Again, it's not his inclusion in the Caledonian Highlander army is not transformative like the addition of Zellenkriegers in Tunguska was. He doesn't add anything that we didn't already do in spades, but he's good. And because he's good, you can take him some of the time. And in a very similar vein, we have the 45th Highlander Rifles, Galwegians. Now, if you are a person who played the Caledonian Highlander Army in M3 and you didn't sell your collection, you probably own like 10 of these guys, or at the very least 4. For me, the average number of these that I take in a list is actually 0, very occasionally 1. And you will pretty much only take the 5-point chain rifle smoke grenade. And yeah, cool, he's 5 points, he's dogged. Like the profile, prima facie, is really solid. It's smoke on 14s, it's berserk with an APCW, it's a chain rifle, it's dogged, and Wallace is going to turn the irregular trooper regular. But I just don't have space in lists for this guy more than some of the time. There are so many other pieces that I have to take that if this guy is in the list, it's because I literally couldn't afford or couldn't fit in a link team that included a 6-point volunteer, because the volunteers are link glue that makes my little 3-person teams fight. Now, if I couldn't, for whatever reason, make that work in the list, and I only have 5 points left, yes, absolutely, I'll put a Highlander rifle in over a tractor mule, for example. But there are just so many pieces that do good close combat assault so much better than a Galwegian that there often just isn't a lot of reason to spend orders on these guys. They don't, because we are only playing to 15 troops, they've just kind of been superseded by far, far higher quality pieces, which we're taking because of the 15 trooper limit. Now, those higher quality pieces cost 20 points, and we're still taking a bunch of them. But yeah, for Highlander Grey Rifles for me these days are a one-off, but we're talking about the close combat elements in the list, and they are worth mentioning. As a sometimes food, sometimes you have the 5 points spare. Now, from here, we are jumping into the spice, the things that you add into lists as flourishes, things to round lists out after you've taken the core of your capability. If I'm being perfectly honest, You can literally only take the profiles I have discussed so far, nothing else, and build very good, very functional 300-point lists. But there is still depth left in the faction, even if it is not always food kind of stuff, and nothing exemplifies that better than one of the best meme troop but viable profiles in the game, the Caledonian Mora. Now, everything about this dude looks incredible until you realize that it's a dogged troop like the Highlander Grey, not a no wound incapacitation troop. And that is the big stopping point, because this guy is not cheap. These are 34 to 40 point pieces, and that is real heavy infantry points, right? Like you can buy an orc for that. And a Mormaya is not a 2 wound piece. But what it is a model that can join a Haris with Highlander Greys, and who has ballistic skill attack +2 damage, and ballistic skill attack armor piercing, which means that that heavy machine gun is damage 17, armor piercing, burst 5. Those T2 rifles are damage 15, armor piercing, T2, burst 4. And that goes pretty hard. That is, if you are willing to roll the dice on those face-to-face rolls, this is like big gun energy. And a Caledonian Mormare holds the record for the only piece in the entire game I have ever had a 2 wound Toha model with Symbiomate go all the way to dead against. And that's just off the back of the fact that damage 17 is a lot of damage. Now, if you take these guys, you are already to an extent committing somewhat to the meme, because 34 to 40 points for a dogged model is kind of a lot. But there are, in addition to the sheer damage output of all of the profiles, there are a lot of consolation prizes. Firstly, they are armor 5, which is a lot of armor. And secondly, within the limits of it's kind of a meme stonk, all of these profiles are pretty viable. I probably wouldn't run any of the lieutenant profiles, but you could, because, 34 points is actually getting back into kind of cheap territory. But NCO, if you aren't running Wallace, is a very solid rule. And you can, like, for the cost of Wallace, you can fit in an NCO, and that NCO Caledonian Mormon in a 3-person link, like, fights incredibly hard. If it lines up on a tag inside good range, it's a colossal threat. Like, it can one-shot blow its way through, like, basically any tag in the game outside of the Mimetism 6 ones if it just engages within 16. And of course, the heavy machine gun is damage 17, etc., etc. Now, I do not take these guys almost ever, and that's because I am a coward. But if you are not a coward and you like a little bit of chest beating and engaging with risk, there is a very good chance that your opponent just looks at the damage output of those things and says, "You know what? You want this more. I'm gonna put the cards on the table. I fold. I am not putting ARO pieces up against the Caledonian Mormare unless they are expendable." Ultimately, it's not for me, but it is a very interesting and cool piece. On the significantly more practical end of things, we have Highlander Caterans. Now, these guys used to be hugely ubiquitous, and as I learned to play the Caledonian Highlander army in N4, I actually found that I wasn't running them like tremendously often, but I will still fit them into lists occasionally. One of the things I would kind of suggest avoiding is anyone who tells you that coordinating 4 Highlander Caterans is a good way of resolving ARO pieces. That's a play that got like bandied about occasionally in N3 as like a way of solving the Kamau, for example, when the Kamau sniper was on its reign of terror. But it's not how I would like to approach things. If you commit to a coordinated order to try and clear an ARO, you have kind of already admitted that there is no other way for you to play your way out of the situation. You've admitted that there's no maneuver solution, there's no smoke solution. It's not something you can avoid. It's not something you can potentially engage with a burst 5 gun, and you have committed instead nearly 100 points of your list to taking that fight. Now, we are, in the list that I'm going to show you at the end of this, going to have an option for a coordinated order ballistic skill attack, but it doesn't rely just on Caterans. It has potentially a little bit more going on. Nevertheless, on their own merits, Caterans are Perhaps a little expensive. They are paying for close combat stats that they will almost never use. And 22 points. If you do not have a frenzy discount, CC22 is the point at which you start actually paying for close combat. But they are otherwise surprisingly solid pieces. Now, Armor 0, not the end of the world. Fist 13, we don't necessarily want to pay for that, but it makes them easy to recover with a paramedic. Otherwise, they are single-use camouflage, mimetism 3, snipers with climbing plus, and climbing plus on a sniper is a nice option. Like, there are often table situations where someone sets something up assuming that someone just wouldn't be able to get to a certain situation. And then there is a Cateran hanging off the side of a building that's like 12 inches high, looking at things that nobody who built the table assumed a model would be able to see. And then they have sniper rifles. They have either half an SWC 21-point regular snipers or one SWC 23-point T2 snipers, which is usually what I would go for if I had the points in SWC. You don't always, but if you can, take the T2 sniper. Now, with surprise and mimetism and BS12 and a mobility skill, you can just take active turn fights with these guys some of the time. And otherwise, they are kind of filling the role of much, much better, more expensive Delamis. Now, they don't have Panzerfaust, but a T2 sniper is still scary, and Mimetism and Ballistic Skill 12 and Sniper Range Bands all make this the kind of thing that just having one of these in a list that just finds a spot somewhere that has a really long line to watch is just annoying enough for your opponent that they present both a threat and an ARO piece that is nice to have. I consider them a little bit of a luxury, but if you can include them, they are good, and they fill that I don't otherwise have any ARO pieces I think I really want to use role that Highlander Caterans can plug that kind of gap. Alternatively, if we want to go much more upmarket, we can look at the Scots Guards 6 Caledonian Infantry Regiment. Now, these are mostly pieces I'm going to suggest avoiding. They are pretty much the only pieces in the faction that they're still within that like points bracket that we're talking about, but they do have some pieces that stray up to 35 points. And we've kind of stopped being efficient at this juncture. Yes, these pieces have mimetism. Yes, they're armor 3. Yes, they're core linkable. But we're starting to get very expensive, and the payoff is not necessarily worthwhile. You can run lists with these guys, and hey, then you have some NCO and etc. But the total loadout, particularly for something like a core link, is not something I'm hugely willing to contemplate. However, there are a couple of pieces, the camouflage options in particular, that I think we can probably consider. The first is the AP Spitfire. Now, again, expensive. 35 points by the standards of Caledonian Highlander army is not cheap. But you don't have a lot of other AP guns, and sometimes you just need something that can maneuver inside HMG range band and threaten a tag. I don't love it for the points cost. It's essentially a very, very upmarket costed Jacques Perrant, but sometimes you just need something like that, and it's not like we don't have enough discount pieces elsewhere in the faction to be able to afford it. Similarly, if you want to pay almost like more than half again the cost over a Highlander Cateran, we have a missile launcher. We have a missile launcher under camouflage. Now, 35 points for an ARO piece, because it is pretty limited at that juncture to an ARO piece. It has an assault pistol. It can do kind of like Noctifer at home duty if it absolutely has to. Assault pistols are good weapons, but mostly you're taking it for the missile launcher. This is the kind of piece that you want to take if you play Caledonia regularly and you play Caterans regularly. You want to take one of these guys just sometimes. And the reason for that is that those camouflage markers in your deployment zones, watching long sight lines, you want your opponent to just be aware that it's probably a Cateran, but it might be a Scot Guard missile. And that changes the calculus on how they're willing to, for example, tempt AROs, move link teams, stuff like that. Overall, these guys are a very sometimes food, but both of those profiles have some utility, and if you are going deeper into the faction, are worth exploring occasionally. Next up, we have tractor mules. Don't laugh, I'm serious. We have tractor mules as something I think you should seriously consider in the Caledonian Highlander army. In particular, I think you should consider the 9-point Katyusha MRL. Now, people who have watched my battle reports will probably have seen this one coming, but I want to just break down why this is so. Firstly, you often have the SWC spare. Secondly, you often have 3 or 4 SAS forward observers. Remember, I said SAS forward observers are the only SAS profile you take apart from Usha, which means you have multiple camouflaged forward observers in your list. Not only that, you have camouflaged forward observers with template weapons and excellent close combat that want to aggressively approach your opponent, but do not have guns that would threaten something if they declare discover against you. So if you cross line of fire of a link team, for example, you're moving through like line of sight of a riot goal missile launcher, just take an example at completely random, or even just something like the humble Fusilier missile or sniper, they are very likely to know because there's no real fog of war around your midfield. It's going to be an SAS and it's going to be a forward observer. They will know that you're not going to threaten them by suddenly revealing to have a Spitfire or something. And that means that they may feel safe to declare discover against you, which makes it harder to progress forward and get into those range bands and close combat where the SAS excel. And by just having a tractor mule sitting in the back of your deployment zone, costing 9 points, generating a regular order, if they declare discover and you are anywhere within 24 inches, you can respond with a forward observer attack, not intending to do anything with the SAS other than target them, but then you have guided missiles in the list. Now, are they good guided missiles? No. They're ballistic skill 10, but that's still hitting on 16s with double action rounds that you paid almost nothing to include in the list. Now, a Riot Girl in a core link is good enough at dodging that she might be willing to wear that. She might also be able to reset through targeted, but just the fact that you have this option makes progressing up the field, and it just opens up plays because you have taken 3 or 4 forward observer camouflage models. The relative potential advantage of taking something like this, even if it never fires, it makes your opponents stop declaring discover at long ranges. And that makes it, look, still like 20 to 30% meme, but only 20 to 30% meme. The only thing that keeps tractor mules out of every Caledonian list I write is that at the end of the day, they are ultimately generally a passive piece, and I have 15 troop slots, and that's all. I need to fill those with as dangerous models as I can, which the tractor mule is only sometimes. Nevertheless, recommend as a consideration if you are playing, in particular, multiple SAS, which you should be. Up next, we have Isabelle McGregor, Volunteer Intel. 24 points for a hacker, and not a particularly good one, is not a great sell, but that really isn't why you are taking Isabelle McGregor. You are taking Isabelle McGregor because the scenario lineup for the tournament that you are playing in includes literally any scenario that requires you to do classifieds, and she is the tax that we will pay for that. Yes, sometimes it's like, I'm playing Unmasking, it would be really nice to have a hacker bonus. You may consider her for that purpose. She is linkable as a wildcard, so you can just slot her into one of those links that I mentioned with the Volunteers and the Highlander Greys. Just pop her in there and she'll be just fine. 24 points is very expensive by the standards of this faction, but sometimes you just need either a specialist bonus in a mission or the ability to do a whole bunch of classifieds. Because she has a regular hacking device, she can do all of the hacking classifieds, she can do all of the spotlight relevant classifieds, and she has decharges, and she's a character. The only thing she can't do is anything requiring a visor or medium plus infantry. But otherwise, if you're in the unfortunate situation of having to play Caledonian Highlander army into highly classified, for example, you just gotta put her in the list. And when you gotta put her in the list, you put her in the list. Finally, and by special request, we have the 9th Wolver Grenadiers Regiment, and not on screen, but also consider him, is First Strike Caden Don, who counts as a Wolver. You can also pop Wallace into this link, and he counts as a Wolver as well, but I generally wouldn't do so. I typically stick to Wolvers. And look, these guys are a linkable pure core. If you are taking these, you have gone way off script to all of the things I have spoken about, what I like about the Caledonian Highlander army, because 5 of these guys actually is very expensive and will use up a huge number of your points, but that's a situation where all of those 6-point volunteers and 5-point Galwegians that are made regular by Wallace, all of them start coming flooding back at this point. You can easily take a 5-person Wolver Corps and still comfortably hit 15 regular orders at the trot. And if you take a 5-person Wolver Corps, you are getting something that is kinda interesting and unique. And that is a heavy infantry level durability, right? Like 2 wounds, armor 3, shock immune, etc., but with absolutely no hackability. These are warbands. They can't even be electromagnetized. These are just warband models. They are heavy infantry levels of durable. They have climbing plus. They will crank you in close combat. Don himself is a particularly dangerous close combat attacker, but all of the others can just berserk you to death fairly comfortably. And again, you're probably taking 5 of them. And the close combat weapons, the close assault weapons, I mean, yes, we'll have a ballistic skill 15 AP Spitfire, and then we'll start doing things with like heavy shotguns and Mark 12s and T2 rifles, light shotguns. And one of these guys rounds the corner with a heavy shotgun or even just a light shotgun in a core link as part of a precursor to a close assault. These guys are a lot of meat that gets delivered upfield kind of very aggressively. You could move in with these guys and just attack and fight and not have a plan to pull back in the same way that you would need that. Like if you ran an invincible army link, you have a lot of orders, but you have these heavy infantry that are vulnerable to certain countermeasures. They can be hacked, they're subject to EM rounds, they don't want to be in close combat. So you dedicate sort of like a significant chunk of your orders as invincibles to pulling your link team back to safety. Wolvers have Climbing Plus, 4/4 move, Link Team Order Efficiency, and you can just run them into your opponent's deployment zone and leave them there. And in the manner of all highly dodgy, durable, with like they have no asymmetric counters, you just have to fight them. In the manner of pieces like that, just having to fight them means that they're your opponent's problem now. And if any of them survive, and noting that they probably have full link bonuses or at least partial link bonuses, which means that even if they've scored kills, Frenzy isn't triggering, and they have multiple burst in ARO, and you can't really kill them in close combat because they have martial arts, natural born warrior. Berserk obviously is not a relevant skill in ARO, but you get the idea. If you are willing to set aside many other very high quality pieces in order to accommodate a Wolver link in your list, and you can get it across the field. Like that's the other thing. These guys don't have weapons that fight longer than 24 inches. But if you can overcome, firstly, the opportunity cost, and secondly, the fact that they don't have smoke themselves, they need that supported by other pieces, and they don't have long range guns, Spitfires where they top out. If you overcome all of that, there are very few like tactical nuclear weapons you can deliver to your opponent's deployment zone better than the Wolvers. Actually, I take that back. What the Wolvers are more than anything else, they're not a tactical nuclear weapon. You ever see that meme that went around in the mid 2000s that talked about the cost of heavy ordnance versus the cost of white goods and proposed literally just dropping Fisher Paykel washing machines on our opponents in colossal numbers? That's the Wolver Grenadiers. They are the army equivalent of literally dropping a colossal mass of white goods directly onto your opponent's head and making it their problem. It is sheer mass. It is sheer mass delivered at speed and with mobility into your opponent's deployment zone, at which point it'll probably kill a bunch and then be their problem. The opportunity cost is high, which is why I do not play with these guys with anything like regularity, but there was a request that they be mentioned, and I'm in good faith, they have some things going for them. Just for completeness, we have Don there on screen now, and you should, even though he is expensive, you should take First Strike Don in a link team of Wolvers, because his close combat is next level, and you're going to be delivering these guys to close combat. He has Martial Arts 2 rather than 1, which means he goes up to CC 26, which means in addition to everything else, Berserk, Natural Born Warrior, etc., he's very, very good at winning face-to-face rolls in CC against anything. And in CC, he has an AP T2 CC weapon, which is very, very dangerous. So again, expensive, more expensive than like a lot of the Wolvers, but having that little bit of extra ability to really punch into like anything in close combat, I think is worth the investment. Okay. So with all of that said, let's tie this all together with a sample list, which is using a lot of the things that I have mentioned in the video so far. And this is the list that we have on screen. And yes, damn your eyes, it begins with a tractor mule, PS attack guided Katyusha MRL. It's 5 SWC and 300 points. It is 15 regular orders because it is a Wallace list, but we can see here it's only taking 3 irregular troopers. We are taking Wallace mostly for the coordinated order aspect of inspiring leadership. So, Combat Group 1, this is an 8-7 split, but you could do this a few different ways. Combat Group 1, we have the Tractor Mule. We then have the 3-person team of a Highlander Grey, a Rifle Paramedic Volunteer, and a Chain Rifle Volunteer. We have one of our 4 SAS Forward Observers, Usha McNeil, and a Cameronian. You can pretty comfortably replace Usha with McMurra. And in fact, I would actually seriously consider doing so depending on the mission that you were playing. I played this in a mission or matchup where I felt like Usha was necessary, but in a vacuum, McMurra is going to be more consistent. So for the exact same points cost, if you're playing this without like any particular foreknowledge of the scenario or opponent or whatever, I would strongly advise taking McMurra over Usha. Her high watermark performance is very high. He is more consistent. He is likely to do more on average. It's just that he will do less than her some of the time. But the average performance of McMurray is higher. In fact, I'm going to make that change now. And done. Okay, we then have the first of two Cameronians, which means that in total, this first combat group has plenty going on. 7 orders is usually going to be enough. We'll often be using O12 Prestige on this combat group, but we have Dangerous Close Assault, we have a Specialist, we have multiple Specialists, we have that support team. That little Highlander Grey team is going to be very good at running around and like rezzing people with the medigun. If you look at this list, there is just high fizz, and this is a Cameronian thing. There is just high fizz across the board. That paramedic, even at ballistic skill 10, usually only needs to hit once, and it's going to be bringing back a Fizz 13, Fizz 14, Fizz 16 kind of piece with distressing regularity. Then in Combat Group 2, this is the 8 trooper list, we have 3 SAS forward observers and a Cateran and Wallace. And this is where we start to get our coordinated order options. Now, most of the time, Wallace will be coordinating these troops, and he'll just be using that to move the Cameronian, which you can see below Wallace, and the SAS around. Just staging the SAS to get them into positions where they can accomplish objectives and get into melee and things like that. However, if there is a piece that you genuinely cannot otherwise overcome and you need to just find a way to shell out or destroy, then consider a coordinated order of the SAS forward observers and the Cateran. The SAS with forward observers can forward observe. They have flat pulse, which can stun, which is sometimes very relevant. And of course, the Cateran is a dangerous piece that threatens to just injure your opponent. This, as a coordinated order, potentially has more legs than trying to brute force through something with multiple Caterans, and it is better in general terms because you are not dedicating so much of your army to being passive. The SAS are active and dangerous pieces. And if you tag something with forward observers, then, I mean, all of a sudden the Highlander Greys are hitting on 16s with burst 5, and that is very serviceable. Otherwise, in this rest of this combat group, we have the Cameronian, as mentioned, a Highlander Grey, and a volunteer paramedic. Now, note about this, that's not a legal duo. What you need to do is you need to start with Wallace in a 3-person Haris team with them, and then just have him leave. He just leaves the link team. The link team stays legal at 2 people, which continues to suppress the frenzy on the Highlander Grey. It still lets the 2 models move around together. Yes, you're losing burst, it's a little less ideal. I mean, you can keep Wallace in the link team, maybe just have him rejoin it. The command tokens are a dime a dozen in the Highlander army because you don't need to spend them on anything except for fighting through loss of lieutenant if you go into loss of lieutenant, or O12 prestige. Like you're not doing anything else other than like you occasionally reform links, you use O12 prestige, and then that's it otherwise. So you can just reform the link if you need to bust Wallace out to do a coordinated order, or you can just leave him in there, or you can just have this be a duo. It's fine either way. We are obviously we're fighting at the edges here. We're looking for every spare point in order to fit all of this, but what a lot of all of this is. 3 dog soldiers and 4 SAS is a huge amount of offensive close combat power, and we have a Cateran and the 2 Highlander Greys, which is quite serviceable shooting, and we have Wallace, and we have Guided. We even have Guided in the list. So overall, this is one of my favorite Caledonian Highlander army lists. It's a tiny percent meme, but it does work, and it works genuinely well. If I was to play with this more, I do expect I would probably find some optimizations to fit into how the list is structured. Looking at this, I think there's actually a good chance that that McMurra might want to jump into Combat Group 2. Like this, for example, which maybe gives us the 6-9 split is maybe a little more comfortable, but the basic setup here I find very enjoyable. Now, if the Katyusha is too much of a meme for you, no problem. You are just going to cut it for something like a 6-point volunteer with chain rifle, which frees up a few points, maybe do something with some other piece somewhere else. Maybe the Cateran, for example, becomes something. You can tinker, you can tailor, but overall, this list is very enjoyable and it plays into many of the strengths that I consider the Caledonian Highlander army has in N4, and those strengths are notable. As always, big thanks to the supporters who made this episode possible. We do have more faction focus videos coming up. I have a number of requests that I'm looking about, which I'll do next. As always, if you want to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. We may have a battle report coming up later in this week. I haven't had a chance to be playing a lot of Infinity recently because I have been preparing for a Conquest Worlds Qualifier event, which has had basically all of my game time and hobby time associated with it. But I'm getting that Infinity itch and I have a game lined up later this week, so we'll see if that makes it onto the channel. Otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.